Hello everyone and welcome to the penultimate day of Phyrexia. All will be one spoilers. We'll get the full set tomorrow, but today we got a smattering of cards that we want to talk about that have some standard relevance and definitely are going to see some limited play. So quick reminders before we get started. Thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring our video. And please remember to like and subscribe so you get further Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler content as the spoiler season continues. And also, we'll be doing a top 10 list in the coming days to give you a good idea of what cards to expect to see in Standard over the next couple of months during Phyrexia All Will Be One Standard season. Alright, let's get started. So in white we had 3 cards today. The first is Crawling Chorus. For a white mana you get a Phyrexian Horror. That's a 1/1. It has Toxic 1, and when Crawling Chorus dies, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature cannot block. Limited playable, not going to see any play in Standard. Hex Gold Hovering Wings. For 3 and a white mana, you get an artifact that's an equipment. It has 4 Mirrodin, so it's going to create a 2/2 red rebel creature token. The equipped creature has flying, and creatures you control that are equipped get +1/+0. The fact that it pumps other equipped creatures is kind of a nice ability, but for 4 mana, that's a pretty high cost for what amounts to a 3/2 with flying. So I think there are better things in equipment than this to see, but the flying ability might make it a little bit playable in Standard. Definitely a good card in Limited. Last here we've got Porcelain Zealot. For 3 and a white mana, you get a Phyrexian Soldier. That's a 2/3. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If that creature has Toxic, instead it gets +2/+2 until the end of turn. Not going to see any play in Standard. Soldier deck doesn't have a place for it, and 4 mana just puts it out of the realm of possibility for that Soldier deck. Good card in Limited because you're likely to have creatures with Toxic, so you're going to be able to pump up their ability to do damage. Next we have 2 blue cards from today, and the first is Distorted Curiosity. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a sorcery with Corrupted. This spell costs 2 less to cast if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Draw 2 cards. So it's an interesting card, but it has to go in a poison deck. And we've looked at poison so far, we've primarily seen it in white, green, and black. So while the Corrupted ability is outstanding, getting 2 cards for 1 mana is a great rate. Having to delve into potentially a 4th color or a 3rd color to add blue, I think is a limitation to it. But I think we will see deck builders try to build this into their decks because, again, drawing 2 cards for 1 mana is a really good rate for us. Next we have Font of Progress. For a blue mana you get an artifact. Font of Progress enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. And then for 3 mana you can tap it and target player mills X cards, where X is the number of oil counters on Font of Progress. Maybe the oil counter deck, if it does end up being blue and red, would want this because it's going to have a couple of oil counters on it automatically, and then if there's some proliferating there, that would help it grow as well. But outside of that, I don't see much of a use for it because mill is not something that's going to be strong in this Standard season. Next we have a couple of black creatures. First we have Duress, very evergreen card in Standard, where you can target your opponent, they reveal their hand, and you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. It's going to see plenty of sideboard play in Standard. Varashka's Fall. For 2 and a black mana, you get an instant. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker and gets a poison counter. Again, limited playable, not going to see play in Standard. Next we have Churning Reservoir. For a red mana, you get an artifact, and at the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on another target non-token artifact or creature you control. So that ability in and of itself, I think, makes it playable in a deck that cares about oil counters, because you're going to be able to put additional oil counters on other things every upkeep. And I've talked about in other videos before about the Filigree Silex and its ability that if you can remove 10 oil counters from permanents you control, it can do 10 damage to anything when you sacrifice it, and that's a great finishing ability. So I think there might be a dedicated oil deck out there and this would be one of the cards I think would have a place in it. Now it has a second ability for 2 mana. You can tap it and create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token. You can only activate this if an oil counter was removed from a permanent you control this turn, or a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into a graveyard this turn. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of this ability being activated, because the idea here is we're going to build up oil counters. We're not trying to sacrifice things or have things die in combat that have oil counters on them. So I think it has some chance of seeing occasional play as something you can use as secondary ability with, but its primary ability is put an oil counter on a non-token artifact or creature every turn. Next we have a number of green creatures from today. The first is Evolving Adaptive. For a green mana, you get a Phyrexian Warrior that's a 0/0. And Evolving Adaptive enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. Evolving Adaptive gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than Evoking Adaptive, put an oil counter on Evoking Adaptive. So I think this is a low-cost investment card that's going to grow at least to a 3/3, probably to a 4/4 in most cases. So 1 mana 4/4, that's a really good card. So I think there's a chance we'll see this in green decks, and certainly in any kind of deck that is focused on oil counters. That would have green as a part of it. All right, next we have Armored Scrap Gorger. For 1 and a green mana, we get a Phyrexian Beast. That's a 0/3, and Armored Scorch Gorger gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and then whenever Armored Scorch Gorger becomes tapped, exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on Armored Scrap Gorger. Now, one of the things that we've seen from this set is there are a lot of high cost 5, 6, 7 mana cards in green that we would want to play. So I can see this as another mana dork in green that would help advance your board state to a place where by turn 5 you can be going ahead and casting 7 mana creatures like Tyrannos Rex. So I think this has a place in standard for that reason, and I think the secondary ability of exiling a card from a graveyard, I think that's actually really important, because anytime it becomes tapped, you have that ability. You're tapping it for mana most likely. You get an oil counter. You get rid of one of your opponent's cards, and we do have enough decks that are looking to take stuff from the graveyard, put it on the battlefield. So this is a really good way to go ahead and use Armored Scrap Gorger's ability to go ahead and exile those cards from the graveyard so they can't be reanimated. So definitely I think it'll see standard play, as long as green is a presence in standard. Next we have Sivlok Battle Chair. For 4 and 2 green mana, you get an equipment. That's an artifact, and it has the 4 Mirrodin ability. You create that 2/2 red rebel creature token, and equipped creature gets +4/+4 and has trample. The thing that makes this unplayable in standard is its 6 mana cost. There's simply better stuff out there. In limited, it's a pretty good card, and the fact that it can be attached to something else if your creature token dies is a good ability, but even that is 7 mana. So at 6 mana, it's the top end of any limited curve, but beyond, because it'll be a 6/6. But beyond that, I just don't see it seeing much play. Last in green, we have a Venomous Brutalizer. For 2 and 2 green mana, you get a Phyrexian Knight. That's a 4/4. It has Toxic 3. And when Venomous Brutalizer enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a green mana. If you do, you get to proliferate. So you get to add tokens to things that already have them, which is very important. And if you're able to play that 2 mana cost, you're probably playing this in a toxic deck, so this will add an additional poison counter to your opponent. I think that in and of itself might make this playable as a 1 or a 2 of in a poison deck or sideboard card, because you're looking for a way to go ahead without doing combat damage to add those oil counters to your, or excuse, not oil counters, but poison counters to your opponent to kill them off it with 10 poison counters on it. Alright, next we have Cephalopod Sentry for 2, a white and a blue mana. You get an artifact creature that's a Phyrexian squid. Its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control, and it has toughness 5. And it also has flying. So a good card overall. I think it has some playability if we do see an Azorius artifact deck. And this could be the top end kind of finisher card for that. If it gets in an attack or two and you've got a big board state of artifacts, it can easily 1 or 2 hits and you've won the game. Next we have Voidwing Hybrid for a blue and a black mana. You get a Phyrexian Bat. That's a 2/1 with flying. It also has Toxic 1. And when you proliferate, return Voidwing Hybrid from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a nice card for early in the game. You play it on turn 2, you attack on turn 3, you do 2 damage, you put a poison counter on your opponent, and you start the poison clock for them. Outside of that, I don't think we're going to see it in any other decks. It's a nice ability, but Dimir decks, Esper decks are probably not going to want this kind of card because it doesn't do enough to go ahead and deal damage to your opponent to actually help you win the game. Unless it's in a toxic deck, it's probably not going to see much standard play at all. Next we have probably the best card of the day in Miglov Maze Crusher. For 1, a red and a green mana, you get a legendary creature that's a Phyrexian beast. That's a 4/4. It enters the battlefield with 5 oil counters on it. You can pay 1 mana and remove an oil counter, and it gains vigilance and menace until the end of turn. For 2 mana, you can remove 2 oil counters from Miglov, and it gets +2/+2 until the end of turn. And for 3 mana, you can remove 3 oil counters from Miglov and destroy target artifact or enchantment. This has a variety of abilities that are very interesting. Giving it vigilance and menace that can hopefully dodge some blocking from your opponent. Being able to give it +2/+2 again could help it survive in combat. If your opponent thinks that they can go ahead and kill it, you can activate the ability, make it a 6/6. Hopefully it sticks around on the board after that. But what I think makes this good is it's only 3 mana. So 3 mana to get this card out. I mean, you could, if we had a 1 mana dorks, you could see this on turn 3, and that would be pretty powerful against anybody because you'd be way out front in terms of board state. So I think this has some playability in some kind of Jund or Gruul deck. We'll just have to see where it fits into standard. Last we have Charforger. For 1, a black and a red mana, we get a Phyrexian Beast. That's a 2/3. And when Charforger enters the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin token. And whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Charforger. And then you can remove 3 oil counters from Charforger, exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. I think this might find a home in the Oni Cult Anvil deck. It's been kind of a mid-level deck in standard throughout the Brothers War season. It had been more prominent before that, but this might be a card that can help revitalize that a little bit because the Oni Cult Anvil deck, it's designed to sacrifice artifacts. So you're going to get an activation at least once a turn from it. So you're going to build oil counters up on this pretty quickly. And again, we talked about the Filigree Silex. Both of these cards work really well with the Filigree Silex to go ahead and get that oil counter count up to 10. So you can take those oil counters off, sacrifice the Filigree Silex, and then do 10 damage. So I think that card is actually looking better and better given the amount of cards that have oil counters on them and how easy it seems like it's going to be to go ahead and generate those oil counters. All right, that's it for today. Spoilers from Phyrexia All Will Be One. I'll be back tomorrow with a final look at the spoilers. The rest of the set should be releasing at some point tomorrow. So we'll be back tomorrow to finish that up, and we'll be then starting to look at our top 10 cards that are going to impact standard as we move forward. So thanks again for staying to the end of the video. Thanks again to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring the video. Remember to like and subscribe so you can continue to get content like this. I'll see you next time.